The author begins with an innocent memory from early childhood, a moment that would later grow in meaning and complexity. He was around 4 years old playing with his first friend, a white boy named Matt, when their game was interrupted by a simple declarative observation. "Brian, you're brown and I'm peach." The remark, so plainly uttered, carried no malice, only the straightforward curiosity of a child. Yet even at that young age, the author was being introduced to one of America's deepest and most insidious lessons. That race, though invisible in biology, was real in the social imagination. Looking back, he imagines that Matt was trying in his own childlike way to do him a favor, to alert him to rules that everyone seemed to know but no one had ever written down, rules that dictated what it meant to be brown or peach in America. This small moment, set in Davenport, Iowa, where his family had moved from Detroit, becomes the seed of a lifelong reflection on race. His parents, both light-skinned black people who grew up in segregated communities, would never have played with Matt's parents. Yet he, their son, was raised in a different time and a different kind of neighborhood, one where color still mattered, even if people no longer spoke of it openly. Race, he realizes, is not a natural division but a social construction, one that has been drawn and redrawn over the course of American history by people determined to maintain power and hierarchy. To make a color line, someone must first pick up the chalk. From that childhood encounter, the author turns to history. The color line in the United States, he explains, was first written into law by the Naturalization Act of 1790, which restricted citizenship to free white persons of good character. In this simple phrase lay the blueprint of a racial order that would persist for centuries. Whiteness, not merit or humanity, was the measure of belonging. Even after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the courts continued to uphold racial distinctions, solidifying them into legal precedent. In countless freedom suits, enslaved people argued for their liberty by tracing a single line of white ancestry, a desperate attempt to cross a boundary that had no biological meaning but immense political weight. That boundary was both arbitrary and vigilantly policed. The courts labored to decide who counted as white, and the results, viewed in hindsight, were absurd. The author recalls how the 1896 Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson enshrined segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal. Homer Plessy, a man of mixed African and French ancestry, deliberately sat in a whites-only train car to challenge the law. But the all-white court ruled against him, arguing that the right to be white was a form of property, and that denying a white man access to that status was tantamount to theft. Whiteness, in other words, was not just an identity, it was an asset, something to be owned, guarded, and protected by law. By the 1930s, the definition of white had become so entangled that legal texts read like satire. The 1934 Corpus Juris defined a white person as including some Armenians and Syrians but excluding Afghans, Filipinos, Chinese, and those with even a fraction of African blood. As historian Barbara Fields once quipped, race is real the same way Wednesday is real, a human invention, sustained by shared agreement but with consequences that could determine life and death. The essay then moves from history back to memory. The author describes growing up around white people, attending schools where most of the black students were in general education while he was placed in a gifted track. The subtle message was that he was one of the acceptable ones, set apart from the rest. The praise stung, though he didn't yet understand why. His lighter skin, middle-class speech, and ease of assimilation made him more palatable to white peers and teachers, yet none of it could protect him from racism. There was always something, the texture of his hair, the tone of his voice, a perceived attitude, that betrayed his difference. He recalls a teacher once labeling him amoral on a report card, and how that judgment contrasted sharply with his third-grade teacher, Ms. Brooks, the first black teacher he had ever had. She was a revelation, a figure of warmth, intellect, and moral courage who introduced him to lessons about justice and the black arts movement. Her classroom exercises on discrimination, including a simulation that divided students by eye color, left a deep impression on him. She even allowed him to perch on top of his desk while he worked, a gesture of understanding that both shocked and reassured his mother. Through Ms. Brooks, he saw the transformative power of black mentorship, the recognition and validation of his full humanity. His mother's vigilance loomed large over his upbringing. Having lived through segregation, she assumed racism's omnipresence and prepared him accordingly. She demanded that he attend the best schools while bracing herself for the discrimination she was certain awaited him there. When he was overlooked for speaking roles in school programs, she raised such a fuss that he was eventually forced to address the entire student body. He sometimes resented her intensity but later understood it as a survival strategy, a mother's effort to armor her son against the indignities she knew too well. By high school, the author began to feel the full weight of racial perception. Popular culture taught him that love and desirability were reserved for the rich and white. Convinced he was neither, he grew anxious about his worth. He also internalized the old adage that a black person must be twice as good to earn half as much respect. His difference became a source of ridicule. A classmate mocked his hair so persistently that he spent months coming home in tears. The cruelty of peers, combined with the indifference of teachers, revealed how deeply racism still infused even seemingly ordinary spaces. When a noose was discovered hanging in the locker of one of the few other black students, the school's casual response, a forced apology from the white perpetrator, made clear the imbalance of justice. Outraged, the author and his best friend wore black armbands in protest. Their symbolic act of resistance was met not with support but with laughter. A teacher mocked them during class, turning their protest into a punchline. "Look at Jones starting a revolution." That moment marked a quiet revelation, the realization that dissent, even in the face of obvious injustice, was often met with ridicule rather than solidarity. In the years that followed, he learned to navigate the world by minimizing his threat. He perfected a no-threat strategy, entering stores with a smile, making eye contact with clerks to signal harmlessness, avoiding carrying unsealed bags. It was a choreography of self-protection, learned through countless small humiliations. He recalls an incident in college when plainclothes agents stopped and searched his bag at an airport, claiming he fit the description of a drug smuggler. Reflexively, he complied, calm and polite. Only later, when his white friends reacted with fury on his behalf, did he realize how numb he had become. Their outrage, he noticed, far exceeded his own. He had internalized the surveillance so deeply that it no longer surprised him. It simply was. Years later, when he encountered W.E.B. Du Bois's haunting question, "How does it feel to be a problem?" he finally had an answer: it feels like numbness. Having woven his personal experiences with history, the author turns to science to dismantle the illusion of race once more. Human beings, he explains, have existed in their current form for roughly 200,000 years, originating in Africa and migrating outward tens of thousands of years ago. Over time, isolated groups adapted physically to their environments: darker skin near the equator to protect against ultraviolet radiation, lighter skin in northern latitudes to absorb scarce sunlight and prevent vitamin D deficiency. These differences are evolutionary adaptations, not the markers of separate biological races. The concept of race as we know it emerged only a few centuries ago, an invention designed to rationalize conquest, slavery, and inequality. The author cites contemporary anthropologists who affirm that genetic diversity within so-called races is often greater than that between them. Even conditions often labeled as racial, such as sickle cell anemia, are in truth geographic rather than racial phenomena. The sickle cell trait, for instance, is found not only among Africans but also in parts of Southern Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia, regions where malaria once prevailed. The gene confers a survival advantage against malaria, not a racial identity. The lesson, repeated across generations of scientific study, is clear: race has no biological foundation. It exists only in the social, political, and economic systems that depend on it. By the end of the essay, the author's journey from the sandbox with Matt to the airport search, from Ms. Brooks's classroom to the long arc of American racial law, forms a seamless meditation on how imaginary categories shape real lives. Race, he suggests, is an invention with enduring power precisely because people keep believing in it, legislating it, and policing it. It is a fiction that organizes reality, determining who belongs and who does not, who is safe and who is suspect. And yet, despite its falseness, its effects are profoundly real. The child in Iowa learned early that color mattered. The adult scholar understands why. Whiteness historically was designed as a gatekeeping device, a property to be owned, a citizenship to be inherited, a privilege to be protected. To be marked as non-white was to be perpetually suspect, no matter one's manners, speech, or success. Assimilation might grant temporary acceptance, but it could never erase the line that others continued to draw. The author closes his reflection by returning implicitly to that childhood moment of revelation. The world that taught Matt to see himself as peach and his friend as brown is the same world that enshrined whiteness as property and difference as destiny. But understanding how those ideas were made, and that they can be unmade, is an act of liberation. Race, like Wednesday, is real because we made it real. To recognize that fact is not to deny its power, but to imagine the possibility of a world in which such inventions no longer govern how we see one another.